Right everyone, how's it going? Welcome back to another video. So in this video I want to talk about how to save CPU and RAM and sort of speed up your computer for music production. These days most new computers have a good amount of power and are much cheaper than they've ever been. For example, let's have a look at a base MacBook Air costs around about $1,500 here in Australia, and it comes with an 8-core CPU. I'm not really sure about these M1 chips or these M chips and whether they really are 8 cores, but 8-core CPU and 8 gigabytes of unified memory and 256 gigabytes of RAM. And comparatively, you can buy a laptop PC for about $900, as we've got here, with kind of similar specs. But when you're starting out in music production, you don't often have loads of money to upgrade your computer, and you kind of have, that typical either a nice student laptop, which might be a MacBook Air or it might be one of these computers, or a halfway decent kind of gaming computer, which might have a bit more RAM, a bit more CPU, and quite a powerful GPU, which is a graphic processing unit. In comparison, my first computer was this thing. So I bought it for $2,700, and it came with a whopping 1 gigabyte of RAM and a Celeron CPU with something like 1.8 gigahertz clock speed. It was only a single core. But it might interest you that it ran just fine and I really had problems with it. The reason for this was simple. I didn't run complex plugins. Most of the productions that I did back when I had this computer, when I started music production, were audio-based projects, and they rarely exceeded 20 tracks, and with limited use of effects or virtual instruments back then, at least, because everything ran through a mixer, and I was doing a lot of pre-processing. So to record something, I'd pre-process it, and I was fairly happy with the sound when it went into the computer in the first place. So it didn't really need a lot of changes or any sort of effects and post-processing. And I would only use EQ and compression for polish, and sometimes I'd use effects depending on what I was doing and if I wanted to do something in post. It wasn't until I started using sample-based virtual instruments and software synths that things started to get more CPU and RAM heavy. And these days, that's the thing that's going to tip you over the edge, or tip your computer over the edge. So in these early days of virtual instruments, it seemed like there was just never enough memory and never enough CPU or storage, really. Things were also painfully slow because you needed a read drive and you also needed a write drive, and they both needed to be connected to SATA. We're also relying on mechanical drives, which were painful because solid-state drives weren't ubiquitous and cheap yet. The cool thing about this Lenovo was that it had a removable SATA dock, and I could plug a drive into the side of it, or a disk drive. Thankfully, these problems are now all but a thing of the past and an anecdote from people like me who remember these times and are old enough to complain about them. But overwhelming your computer is still possible because it's as music production technology gets better, it also places more strain on our computers. And when you're starting out as a musician, you need something that fits your budget and music production needs. People often ask me how much RAM to get and whether they should upgrade to another CPU, or complain to me about their computer, how it can't take the load of projects and that sort of thing. The first thing I usually say is that they don't need to rush out and buy a new computer. You just need to know what settings to adjust and possibly modify your workflow. There are also alternative and cheaper solutions to some of the challenges home producers face. So here are a few things you might want to think about to help you troubleshoot your computer power in music production. So the way that overload on your CPU usually plays out is that it's a clicking and popping. And when you've got a lot of tracks going, and usually that's indicated by the fact that you're using too many plugins and your CPU is really struggling. In most DAWs these days, you can actually monitor your CPU performance. So for example, in Logic, up here where you've got your tempo, your time display, you can click on this arrow down here and you can bring up custom. And when you click on custom, CPU and hard drive performance comes up. If you double click the CPU, a little window comes up that tells you about your performance on both your hard drive and your processor. And here, you can get a sense of how hard or not hard your computer is working. So that's one way to get a sense of what's going on. If, for example, you see that it's working really hard and it's probably working too hard for your liking, and it might be overheating, or it might be doing things like clicking and popping, you can try and change your settings in audio settings. So in Logic Pro, for example, if you just go to Settings, Audio, in here you'll get a whole bunch of options, including what audio devices you want to use, but you'll have what's called an in-out buffer size, okay? So this is the amount of time it takes for the software to basically process your audio that's coming in and then coming out of your devices. Right now, mine's set to 512. If you have this down to 32, for example, it's using a lot of CPU power in order to process all of the information that's going into it and then out of it, okay? So what it's doing is this 32 sample rates is really, really fast, and what it's doing is it's going through, and then it's like audio is coming through your audio interface, it's going through the system, and then it's got to run through all these plugins, and then it's going to come out of your output, okay? It's going to be sent back out as new audio. And to do it at a sample rate of 32, it's really taxing on your CPU. If you up it to 1024, it's a lot less taxing on your CPU, but what happens is that the latency is then increased. So as you can see, resulting latency is 52 milliseconds when it's 1024 versus 7 milliseconds. So that's quite a substantial round trip that it's got to make. So this is definitely something to consider. You might have the buffer size might be too low. And the way that you would kind of approach this is if you are recording, you can have a very low buffer size, because it doesn't take much for your computer to actually take audio and then print it. Okay, so recording audio doesn't take very much CPU power. So that means that it can have a really high buffer size. But when it's got to process everything through, say, a plugin, then it will need more of time to do that, and to do that effectively, and to run the multitude of things that you might have open as well. So the way that I kind of advise people is that a low buffer size is good for when you're recording, and a high buffer size is good for when you're mixing. Okay, so all of your stuff's been recorded, and it doesn't really, like, the latency doesn't really matter at that point. So that's something to consider. Also, in saying that, if you're someone who likes to have mix as they record, I know I used to be like that, and I've stopped doing that. The reason why I've stopped doing that is because it's a lot better if you just make sure that you get, the input sound, so the sound that's going, the performance, the mic positioning, the microphone you're using, the gain set. If you're going to do any pre-processing, if you're running it through a channel strip or something like that, make sure all of that is right. And usually you don't have to do too much post-processing. If you're mixing as you go, like you record something and then you chuck a bunch of effects on it and then go to record something else, it's going to put strain, it's going to create resultant latency latency, and that's problematic. So you need to really think carefully. My advice would be record everything first, just make sure you've got a good input signal, you've recorded a good sample, or an audio clip, and then process it after. All right, so let's just say you're someone who uses a lot of virtual instruments. Now, there are going to be virtual instruments that don't use very much CPU, and then there are going to be some virtual instruments that use a lot of CPU. So the less intensive virtual instruments are usually virtual instruments that take a sample, play it back. So that's really typical of, say, string instrument libraries. So I've got Spitfire Audio's alternative solo strings here, which really isn't using very much CPU. As you can see, it's saying that it's using around about 6 to 7. And on the right-hand side there, you'll see that the performance meter isn't really moving at all. So it's only using one thread, and that thread's not barely used at all. And then there are some software synths. Sorry, there are some context synthesizers that use way more CPU. So for example, Slate and Ash's Cycles is notorious for using a lot of CPU. Sounds great, but as you can see, it's 30% there. So that's just playing one chord. And the reason for that is because what Slate and Ash is doing is taking an audio sample and then it's processing it through a whole bunch of plugins in real time. And whenever it's doing that, it's then using a lot of CPU. So as you can see, it's spiking one of my cores. And that can sometimes be problematic. So I've just got one sound at the moment, but if I had several of these loaded, it would pop and click and it would create issues. One simple solution for something like a really CPU intensive virtual instrument is to basically just record what you want to play while you've got the CPU powered in order to do that, and then print it. So for example, I'll show you. All right, so basically what I've done, I've just created a MIDI track, and then what I'm gonna do is just bounce in place. And then this has now been created an audio file, which is barely using any CPU at all. So what's really cool about that is then you can basically use that to do whatever. But I mean, obviously you need to think about how you're going to arrange and when you're going to play particular elements in order to then bounce in place. I bounce in place all the time. It's the way that I work. It's not so much about CPU issues, but I feel like it's just a lot better to work with samples than it is to work with MIDI. The other issue with software synths is they use a lot of RAM in some instances. Now, for example, this alternative solo strings cello is only using 208 megabytes of RAM, but that's because it's sample based. So it's kind of flip side. With regard to sample based instruments, they tend to use a lot of RAM, but with sample based synthesizers or synthesizers, they tend to be less RAM intensive, but CPU intensive. So with software instruments, it's also an interesting kind of trade-off. If you've got something like a sample-based instrument like Spitfire's alternative solo strings, it's going to use more RAM than it will use CPU. Whereas in some instances, some sample-based contact synths, for example, will use both a lot of CPU and a lot of RAM because they're using a lot of samples and they're using a lot of processing in real time. So there's a couple things you can do when RAM is an issue. Firstly, when you start up a project, you can, if you right click on the track list, if you go to something like, I don't know what it will look like in other DAWs, but in Logic, for example, it looks like this. So you go to configure track header and you can enable and disable a whole range of parameters within the track list. So, for example, with this particular software instrument, what I could do is actually enable the on-off button. Enabling the on-off button means that you can basically just turn it. If you turn it off, it'll dump everything, all of the RAM. It'll dump everything from RAM. It'll basically not use that track anymore. So that's one way you can do it. If you set up your templates in a way where you've got this on-off button here, you can basically just go and turn things on and off when you need them. Okay, so that's one way you can do it. So as you can see now, it's loading it all up, but I've turned it on. The other thing you can do is you can purge your samples. So in Contact, not all sample libraries are like this, but in Contact, what you can do is you can purge all your samples, right? So let's purge everything, meaning that there's nothing loaded for these instruments. But when I actually play it back, what it will do is it will go through the hard drive, it'll as quickly as it possibly can, find the samples in order to play back. Alright, so now that that's done, you can see there's way less RAM being used. So for the cello, it's 476 kilobytes, and for cycles, it's 5 megabytes. So that's one way you can substantially reduce the amount of RAM being used in your projects, which is purging samples. So let's just say you're not using something that has that kind of purge all samples capability. Something like Spitfire Audio's BBC Symphony Orchestra, when it first came out, didn't have that ability. So basically, if you loaded an instrument, you had to wear it. And it was using a lot. It was really CPU intensive, this plugin, when it first came out. But they've made a lot of updates to it, because you just need to be able to do it. In some instances, if you've got like 50 to 200 tracks, you just can't be, all of your tracks can't be using all that much RAM just to play one string line, for example. So as you can see, Strings Violin 1 uses 731 megabytes, okay? But what we can do is we can go through and basically remove a bunch of these. So let's just say we wanted to remove all of them except for the legato. Now legatos tend to be high CPU RAM usage because of the nature of them. So now we've managed to halve it. Okay, so we can't purge all of the samples, but we can halve it, because we can have all of the legato samples loaded rather than all of the articulations loaded. So that's one way to go about it. So again, using a combination of this and printing or bouncing in place, we can play the line and then bounce it as audio in order for it to, so that we can basically free up our RAM to be able to do other things. The other thing you could do is you could use freeze tracks. So let's just say we like this line, we've got it on, but we want to have it on. We also want it to be audio, but we don't want to clog up our entire project with audio, bouncing in place. So what you can do is, if you go to configure track header, you can also choose to freeze your regions. This means that what it will do is, if you click this freeze button, the next time you press play, it will basically just bounce it in place. So now this here, instrument 10, is an audio file rather than a MIDI file, until we unfreeze, at which point we can modify it. So while this is frozen, we can't do anything with it, but if we unfreeze it, it'll load up all the samples. It will just basically be like a normal software instrument, but for now it behaves like an audio track. Finally, there's a few other things that you might want to consider. Say, for example, if you just need the extra RAM and you need the extra CPU for whatever reason. So you might have a really, really great software synthesizer, or you might have a great strings library or some sort of orchestral library that you've just bought, and it's just huge, and you love using Mac, for example, and you loathe turning to PC. Well, there are other alternatives. So, for example, Vienna Symphony Library created this thing called Vienna Ensemble Pro 7 or Ensemble Pro software, which means that you can connect a Mac and a PC, or a PC and a PC and a Mac and a Mac together as servers. So you could have one being a slave and one operating the DAW. The beauty of this is that you can have, if you've got a computer lying around, everyone's got something lying around, whether it's an old desktop or another laptop. You can basically combine the two for the fraction of the price of a computer. I made a video about that, and it'll pop up in the card will pop up in a second. But essentially, you can connect a PC with a Mac. You can operate everything on a Mac, and then you've got the ability to upgrade your PC if you need to. It's a really good way to do. It's a cost-effective way to basically have really large projects and offload the CPU and RAM and storage onto another computer. The other thing to consider is just buying a hard drive, a solid-state hard drive. It's important to have additional storage anyway. Everything you have should really be solid-state. Mechanical drives are really only good for backups these days, as far as I'm concerned. I do have a mechanical drive which stores all of my sample libraries, but the ones that I absolutely use all the time just sit on a solid-state drive. And I have one for recording, and I have one where I keep all of my samples. The reason for that is then the computer can it offloads the pressure on your hard drive. Alright, so I hope you found this video useful. If you have any questions, pop them in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe and like the video, and I'll catch you in the next one.